Our guest today is author and scholar Robert Paarlberg, and he's had a very long and illustrious career in academia, retiring from Wellesley College in 2015. His research interests include international food and agricultural policy, poverty reduction, nutrition, and sustainability. He's also the author of numerous books, and most recently, the highly readable and insightful Resetting the Table, straight talk about the food we grow and eat. So Rob, thank you again for being here. And we're just going to jump right in. So many proponents of slow, organic, local food are well-fed Westerners, people who are fortunate to have a choice about what to eat. Yet your travels have given you a wider perspective. Could you talk a little bit about what slow, organic, and local looks like in developing nations, especially for women and smallholder farmers?
Sure. This first occurred to me when I was attending an event at Harvard University, where I have an appointment, and the speakers were claiming that sustainable food in the future would have to be organic, local, and slow. And I just come back from a research trip to rural Africa, where I'd been interviewing women farmers, and it occurred to me, well, they're in a food system that actually is organic, local, and slow. They're living an extreme version of the Harvard dream. They were organic because they couldn't afford any synthetic fertilizer. It was a local system because the roads were so poor, transport costs made it impossible to get inputs in or to market their products out. And it was certainly slow. They had to do everything by hand, including planting, harvesting, stripping, pounding, soaking, drying the maize before they could make a hand fire and then cook a meal for their family. And in spite of all that effort, many of their children were stunted and they were living in poverty. And so I said, oh, wait a minute, if this is the extreme version of an organic, local, and slow food system, why is it that so many progressive elites are promoting that idea here in the United States?
So is there an inherent elitism or perhaps even racism in these calls for widespread adoption of organic, agroecology, non-GMO, and other systems of low productivity farming?
No, I wouldn't go that far. I think it's mostly insulation from the realities of food production. I mean, I live and teach in New England, and a lot of my students spend their summers working on local farms. Many of these are very small organic CSA farms. They sell at farmers markets. They're a very important part of rural culture in New England. They're very attractive, diversified farms. They have animals as well as many different kinds of crops. To my students, this looks like an ideal. Why can't all of farming look like this? They say to themselves. Until I tell them that the Census of American Agriculture indicates that all of the farm sales made in all of the states of New England, and that includes Rhode Island, Connecticut, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Vermont, and Maine, all those farm sales amount to only about 1% of all farm sales in the United States. This is a culturally attractive style of agriculture, but it just doesn't produce enough food. And many of these small New England farms are hobby farms, retirement farms, part-time farms, agritourism farms. They're not a model that we could scale up and satisfy the food production that we need.
Mm-hmm. People are free to leave questions in chat, and then we'll visit those a little bit later in the conversation. Why is there so much romanticism about farming, especially old ways of farming that were and are so often associated with drudgery and poverty?
Well, we're all, even I'm susceptible to sentimentality. My dad grew up on a small farm in Indiana. My mom's family also comes from farming in Minnesota and in the Dakotas. I used to work on a farm, on my uncle's farm when I was a kid, enjoyed it a great deal. It's a welcome relief if you're doing it only briefly, and if you're not doing it for a living, it's a welcome relief from a lot of urban and suburban life. But there aren't too many people who are doing it for a living who can afford that kind of sentimentality. It is when we had a lot of small local organic farms 100 years ago in the United States. And remember, before we invented synthetic nitrogen fertilizer back in 1910, all of the food produced all around the world since the beginning of time had been de facto organic. The definition of organic is no synthetic chemicals. But back 120 years ago or 110 years ago, farming was not a particularly attractive way of life. Farm households earned 1/3 less than non-farm households. The children got shortchanged in their schooling. Many of them didn't do anything but work on the farm before they went to school, and after they came home from school. They didn't graduate from high school. It was not a wonderful life for farm women. They were usually excluded from management decisions on the farm, even though they did more than their share of the farm work in addition to raising and feeding their families. The minute people in these situations had a chance to graduate from high school and take a job in town, maybe a factory job with a union contract, higher wages, a summer vacation, they took that chance. And I don't want to argue. They were voting with their feet that traditional farming, which was labor intensive and not financially rewarding, may not be the best place for them to spend their whole life. Now, of course, when large numbers of people left agriculture in the United States 100 years ago, that allowed those that remained to consolidate properties, have more land. That made it affordable for them to use machinery, labor-saving machinery. The more highly capitalized they became, the easier it was for them to afford the technologies that give us the high productivity that we have today, and allow farmers today to have, on average, a household income that's a third higher than the household incomes of non-farmers. That's a history that I don't regret. I think it's one that has served us pretty well.
You know, on that note, there's a lot of negativity directed toward highly productive big farms in the US. I mean, they're often characterized as industrial, even though, as you know, most of them or many of them are family owned. And smallholder farmers are idealized, even though the FAO says that in developing nations, the majority of them are both hungry and poor. Why are there so many false perceptions around food, and how do we bring reality into these debates?
Well, one of the most important misperceptions that I encounter is the assumption that modern commercial agriculture in the United States is environmentally unsustainable compared to traditional, small, diverse farms. The assumption is that our large, specialized, call them industrial, if you will, farms are doing more damage to the environment than the farms that they replaced. And this is simply not true. On a per bushel of production basis, today's large commercial farms use much less water, much less energy, much less land, not just less labor, much less land. And compared to 40 years ago, they use fewer chemicals, sometimes even in absolute terms. People don't understand this. Our farms in the United States today are producing 3 times as much as they did in 1940. And so they do environmental damage. There's no doubt about it. But if we tried to produce 3 times as much using the methods of 1940, the environmental damage would be much greater. When I tell my students, everyone is concerned with how much corn we produce. The image is that we covered the Midwest with nothing but cornfields. Well, we are producing a lot of corn. Compared to 1940 today, we're producing 5 times as much corn, but we're planting 20% fewer acres to corn. And we're using 41% less energy for every bushel of corn we produce. We're using emitting 31% fewer greenhouse gas emissions for every bushel that we produce. And we're using 46% less irrigation water for every bushel that we produce. Modern methods use fewer resources per unit of output. That's the measure of productivity that economists value. And it is also, it has as a secondary effect, it protects the environment. And look at crop farming overall in absolute terms, not per bushel of production, but in absolute terms. Fertilizer use on American farms has not increased since 1981. It's been flat, even though total production has increased 44%. So fertilizer use per bushel has gone way down. Pesticide use in absolute terms is 18% lower today than it was in 1981. Insecticide use on American farms is more than 80% lower today than it was in 1972 at the peak. A lot of my students don't know these things. They've only read about the resource intensity of commercial farming in the United States. They don't realize that commercial farming today has used applications of modern science, GPS satellite controlled machinery, variable rate application, digital soil mapping, genetically engineered crops that self-protect against insects, computer-controlled drip irrigation. They've used applications of modern science to reduce their environmental footprint dramatically. They still do damage, as I say, but that's because of how much is produced, not the methods used in production.
So you make a very good case for the productivity of modern agriculture, and yet people still don't really understand those kinds of figures and that reality. So, you're a teacher, you're a writer, two ways that are very effective in getting the word out, but how can we help people understand really the true picture of farming and production in the United States and around the world?
We obviously haven't found the answer to that question. I'm not sure my book is going to be the answer. I do my best in this book to show my readers that my support for modern commercial crop farming is not blind. I'm critical of some elements of livestock production. I point out that applications of modern science in the livestock sector have been environmentally friendly, just like for crops, but they haven't always been good for animal welfare. Animals are sentient beings, they're not plants. And when you go for maximum productivity, you end up developing genetics in animals that are not healthy for the animals and aren't even good for the quality of the meat. We're pulling back a little bit from the kinds of broiler chickens that we developed over the last several decades that put on weight much too quickly for their own health and for the quality of the meat. So I'm critical on animal welfare grounds of livestock systems in the United States. I say we should go in the European direction, which is not to put the animals back out on pasture. That's not going to work, but regulate indoor systems to give them more space, more enrichment, more light, less noise. The Europeans have learned to do that, and it hasn't eliminated livestock production in Europe. Europe still produces more pigs than the United States. And in order to, once again, try to convince my readers that I'm not blindly in love with the direction of things in our food and farming sector, I spend a whole chapter criticizing food manufacturing companies, food retailers, and the food service industry. We have major problems with dietary health in the United States. 42% of all adults in the United States are now clinically obese. And obesity contributes to, according to the National Institutes of Health, to 300,000 deaths a year in the United States. And I blame a lot of this on private food companies. And I know this is the Alliance for Science, but I have to say, on the corporate food scientists that they hire in order to design food products that are unhealthy, but virtually addictive. These are very smart people. They know how to manufacture products with just the right combination of added sugar, added salt, and added fat, so that the product will hit a bliss point inside your mouth and trigger the reward circuit in your brain and teach you to want that food whenever you see it advertised. Or they put in sugar, too much sugar, and that spikes our insulin. The calories go straight to the fat cells and leave us unsatiated. So we want more. These are, the industry comes back and says, well, wait a minute, don't blame us. We don't put a gun to your head. You're the ones that are eating these foods voluntarily. You're putting them in your mouth. It's your personal responsibility what you eat. But when I look at obesity trends in the United States, when I see that adult obesity has tripled since the 1960s, I say to myself, well, wait a minute. Has personal irresponsibility tripled in the United States since the 1960s? Absolutely not. I blame the manufacturers of these products. And to some extent, I regret the fact that science has been put at the service of these companies, creating a serious dietary health problem for Americans. But even when I do that in my book, I may not convince today's critics of large-scale, specialized, science-intensive commercial farming that they should abandon their nostalgic view that small, organic, and local and slow is the way to go.
You wrote some very fascinating things about both the food manufacturers and animal welfare that I'd like to get into. But just to sort of return to this idea of the influencers and polarization, it seems that many people involved in the food farming issue want the same things, food that's tasty, safe, nutritious, affordable, sustainable, socially and economically just, with good animal welfare. So why is there so much polarization in this particular issue?
Well, it's like a lot of our current polarization. It tends to be regional. If you ask opinion leaders, bi-coastal opinion leaders from New York or from the San Francisco Bay Area, what an ideal food system would look like, they'll say one thing. If you ask people who've gone to agricultural schools at Midwestern universities, people who grew up in flyover country, but know about it firsthand and have some family memories of how things have actually improved in farming, you'll get a completely different answer. And until these groups encounter one another face to face more often, we may not make a great deal of progress. It's all too easy for bi-coastal opinion leaders in an echo chamber to just keep reinforcing one another. And the students, the idealistic progressive students who go to elite schools follow those leaders. They're brilliant journalists, commentators, entertainers. They know a great deal, but they may not know a great deal of agricultural economics. They may not know a great deal about agronomy. They may not know a great deal about animal science. They put out a lot of information that scientists laugh about. Unfortunately, they don't take it seriously. They should take it seriously because it's what young people are learning today.
That the whole idea of influencers is very important. And I have two questions in that regard. So one is, we've seen people like Michael Pollan, Mark Bittman, Vandana Shiva, who have no real experience in farming, but they've been very effective in shaping certain narratives about food and its production. What are the ramifications of allowing writers and academics to direct and influence food policies? And is there a way around that?
Well, I don't want to stop academics from influencing opinions about food and agricultural policy. A lot of A lot of journalists, however, are not academics, and their training is to go out and talk to people. They don't read journal articles, let alone write academic journal articles the way academics do. Academics have to do that, or they're not going to be academics for very long. Journalists are very industrious, very hardworking. They talk to people and record what they're told, and then pass it on in digestible language to their readers. And unfortunately, they pick who they go out to talk to. Mm-hmm. And they usually find someone whose opinion they already embrace, and then they amplify that opinion in the story that they write. And yeah, journalism is like everything else. It's polarized as well. You encounter, go on cable TV, you get two completely different views of the world when you go from channel 41 to channel 42.
Mm-hmm. So, those are the sort of external or the influencers we're aware of. But, there are also the financial influencers, the behind the scenes. You mentioned that there's no successful model of agroecology anywhere in the world, yet the FAO continues to support it. Similarly, there is scientific consensus on the safety of GMO foods, yet activists continue to revile it and governments continue to prohibit it. What do you see as the role of donors, be they philanthropic or international agencies, and conflict activism in perpetuating these falsehoods, these ideologies, the polarization? And what can we do about these influences?
Yeah, we'll start with FAO embracing agroecology. And my book goes into agroecology at some length and shows that it is widely embraced by non-governmental organizations headquartered in rich countries who want an alternative to what they call industrial agriculture or green revolution farming. Farmers in the developing world, they're willing to work on agroecology projects if they're paid to do it, and the projects can produce good results, but it's too labor intensive on their own land when no one's paying them to work, when they have to grow enough crops to sell to earn a living. They don't want all the labor intensive hand gardening practices that agroecology emphasizes, constantly pruning or building and rebuilding, building raised beds, and carrying in a lot of mulch, hand harvesting, taking care of a lot of animals in and around the crops. That's too much labor time for them, and so they drift away from it. But the NGOs that promote these projects have enormous influence inside the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization. FAO now gives official status inside the organization to thousands of NGOs, and they pay close attention to what FAO does. These NGOs don't have quite as much influence on actual governments in the developing world as they do on United Nations organizations. Mm-hmm. They focus, and governments don't pay much attention to United Nations organizations, but NGOs do. And so when there's a food summit, like there was last fall, the NGOs get a loud voice, and they've persuaded FAO to promote agroecology. I don't think the promotion will change the minds of the real stakeholders, the farmers in the developing world who want a return on their labor, not just a feel-good attempt to imitate nature using artisanal practices that try to do that. But different constituencies have different influence in different zones. Now, you mentioned biotechnology also. Mm-hmm. Here, Europeans took a lead in the original rejection of genetically engineered crops among developed countries, and I think there were a number of reasons, and some of them are somewhat innocent. European consumers in 1996, when the first generation of GMO crops, genetically engineered soybeans and corn and cotton were put on the market, European consumers didn't see much of an advantage for themselves here. The GMO soybeans didn't taste any better. They weren't any nutritious. They weren't any more nutritious. They didn't prepare any better. And when the soybean oil was mixed with other ingredients in packaged products, it wasn't any cheaper. European consumers didn't see anything to gain here. And European farmers didn't stand a whole lot to gain either. They didn't grow a lot of soybeans. Very few grew a lot of corn. They didn't grow a lot of cotton. These products were highly attractive to farmers in the United States, but to consumers and also farmers in Europe, they weren't that attractive. So the slightest accusation of risk was enough to create political space for groups like Greenpeace and Friends of the Earth to launch effective campaigns against these products. It didn't help that the first soybeans, genetically engineered soybeans from the United States, arrived in European ports in March of 1996, which is exactly at the moment the mad cow disease crisis hit. Mm-hmm. Food safety regulators in Europe had told consumers eating meat from diseased animals was perfectly safe. But in March 1996, they had to admit it wasn't safe, that they'd made a mistake, that you could get a fatal disease. Well, European consumers said, well, wait a minute, they were wrong about mad cow disease. Maybe they're also wrong when they tell us the soybeans are perfectly safe. So that created space for a campaign against a technology that most Europeans didn't really need. Unfortunately, European regulations on the technology came to be viewed by growers in Africa in particular and Asia as the best practices. They embraced the same regulations, and that's why GM food crops have barely spread around the world over the last 30 years.
Mm-hmm. You do mention that while many of the food movements have failed to hold sway, the anti-GMO activists have been remarkably successful in stymieing the development of GM foods. But now we're seeing China moving heavily into biotech foods, the advent of gene editing, which offers both climate and consumer benefits, and the rising purchase power of millennials who don't fear technology. So what do you see as the future of biotechnology?
Yeah, it's still a bit of an unknown. I think we have to distinguish between transgenic biotech crops, the GMOs, mm-hmm. that have been around since the mid-1990s, and gene-edited crops. The transgenic crops that are regulated under GMO directives in Europe and in many other countries are going to have a hard time crawling out from under those stifling regulations that usually include not just mandatory labeling, but also case-by-case government approval, segregation from non-GMO crops, tracing, audit trail tracing through the marketplace. Because of these regulations, we don't have any GMO varieties of wheat being grown commercially anywhere in the world. We don't have any GMO varieties of rice being grown commercially anywhere in the world. Fruits and vegetables, almost nowhere. A little bit of brinjal in Bangladesh, a little bit of papaya in Hawaii. But most of the transgenic crops that are being grown today are being grown for animal feed, like yellow maize and soybeans, or industrial crops like cotton. For food crops for direct human consumption, transgenic technologies have mostly been stopped in their tracks. China hasn't yet commercialized any transgenic food crops, even though they had them developed back in the late 1980s. They just have not gone forward. Every time you think they're going forward, they pull back. I think there's a much greater chance that gene-edited crops using technologies like CRISPR, much greater chance that they will go forward for a number of reasons. First, they more nearly resemble natural mutations. They don't have to include any foreign DNA from another species. You can mimic natural mutations and create an improved variety using genetic engineering, but without the foreign DNA that frightens consumers. Also, it's an easier, simpler, quicker, cheaper way to improve crops. And so this technology will be quickly in the hands of academics, of nonprofit organizations. It won't be as heavily dominated by large agribiotech companies. That you don't have to have a huge budget to use CRISPR. And so the complaint that GMOs were the product of profit-making companies and dangerous because we don't like those companies, that'll be a more difficult charge to make in this case. Also, the fact that they don't have any DNA will make it much more difficult for governments to impose onerous regulations. You won't be able to identify which crops have been edited and which have not. It mimics a natural mutation. And you mentioned China, and this is important because while China has not commercialized any transgenic crops yet, other than some poplar trees and tobacco 40 years ago, and
cotton.
But China has jumped in with both feet when it comes to CRISPR crops. They have invested enormous human resources, and they have more patents for CRISPR agricultural technologies than the United States. They have more publications surrounding more peer-reviewed journal publications for this technology than the United States. And just this January, they signaled that their regulatory system for these CRISPR crops was not going to treat them like GMOs. They weren't going to be under the stifling blanket of GMO regulations. If they didn't contain foreign DNA, they were not going to encounter those regulatory hurdles. So I can imagine if China goes forward with this new technology, it's going to be much easier for and China's going forward in part because they don't export a lot to Europe. So they don't have to worry about Europeans blocking their agricultural exports because they're gene edited. If China goes forward, it'll be much easier for Africans to go forward, for Asians to go forward. That will leave the Europeans isolated, and maybe eventually Europe is going to have to back away from its current policy, which is to treat gene edited crops as GMOs and regulate them accordingly.
And one reason, of course, why China is moving into this is just to improve its own food security, which is, we see Singapore investing heavily in the development and production of synthetic meats and other products to ensure its food security, while others see them as climate smart and a way to move beyond the ills of animal agriculture. Yet these products have been rejected by some food purists as unnatural and highly processed. Given these divergent views, what do you see as the future of synthetic foods, particularly in the livestock area or the meat area, faux meat area?
Yeah, well, we have, of course, two different thrusts for animal-free meat products. One is plant-based imitation meats, like Impossible Burgers or Beyond Burgers, or plant-based imitation animal products, like almond milk or coconut milk or rice milk or oat milk, or plant-based imitation eggs. We have all those things on the market now, and the availability is increasing rapidly. Sales are increasing rapidly, although from a very low base. Plant-based imitation milks are now 13% of the fluid milk market in the United States, which is pretty good and growing rapidly. Plant-based imitation meats are only about 3% of the so-called meat market in the United States, but they're much more available in retail stores than they were just 2 years ago. So I expect that share to increase. The other thrust is cell-cultured animal-free meats, where you use cells from real animals, muscle cells from real animals, and grow them in a culture, grow them out to be real muscle meat from real animals, but you're not using animals. It's the advantage of both of these approaches in my view, is a large reduction in the environmental impacts of livestock production. You require 90% less land. You emit 90% fewer greenhouse gas emissions. You use much less water. These animal-free products are an environmental plus. They're not necessarily more nutritious than, a Beyond Burger isn't much more nutritious than a real animal-based hamburger. But the environmental benefits are considerable. If the price of these products keeps coming down, and I think it will, they'll take over a significant part of the market. Maybe not 13% in the next decade, but I would guess 13% in the decades ahead. As there's a lot of corporate money going into developing improved versions of these products. Big meat companies like Tyson and Cargill, big food companies like Nestle. It's not just little startups now. These are the giants that are coming in, and they can afford expensive science to make these products even better imitations of a real meat experience, and to promote these products. So I think we'll see. This may not reduce the size of animal herds in the next 10 years that much, but I think it's a pathway to reducing our dependence on animal products for the future, especially in countries where those animal products are going to become much more heavily used otherwise. The rapidly growing middle-class countries in Asia in particular. And it bothers me a little bit that these products have been dismissed by progressive opinion makers because they're processed or because they're patented or because they're inauthentic. If you're concerned, these are all critics of the livestock industry. These people have been savage critics of the livestock industry for years, and if they can't see this move away from real animal products to animal-free products, with all the environmental benefits it will bring, if they can't see that as progress, then I think they're a little bit too fixated on boutique concerns like processing and authenticity.
Yeah, we might have different ideas on how to define progressive in that regard. I think so. I like to call them progressives because in some regards they are progressive, but in other ways, not at all. So this brings us back to the livestock industry, which, I think interests me and a lot of other people. You note that there's been this incredible productivity that's been achieved, but also that it's come at the cost of animal welfare. So how can we restore some balance? Will it be driven by animal activists and citizens' initiatives, government regulations, the marketplace? How do you see this sorting out?
Well, as I hinted before, I think the pathway we should follow is to follow Europe's lead and to keep the animals indoors. It's more biosecure for them to be out of contact with rodents, with wild birds, with feral pigs. Animals outdoors are exposed to all sorts of endoparasitic diseases, not to mention threats from extreme temperatures. Keep them indoors. Actually, I talked to a lot of veterinarians and animal welfare experts in writing my book. And one of them reminded me that our domestic food animals today are all descended from wild animals that were prey, not predators. And they're not necessarily comfortable out in nature all the time. If you give them a choice of being outdoors or indoors, they often prefer indoors. But once you've brought them indoors, you have to do a much better job than we've done in giving them space, in giving them light, in giving them social interaction with other animals, in giving them enrichment. The European Union has done that. They've not moved the animals outdoors, but their indoor facilities by regulation have to provide much more space. In fact, pig farmers in the European Union have to, these are very intelligent animals. They're more intelligent than my pet cat or your pet dog. I hate to tell you that.
Yes, I know.
But they are easily bored, and the European Union regulations require that they be given toys, really, things that they can manipulate for enrichment purposes. These make pig housing in the European Union a little bit more expensive, but housing for pigs is only about 10% of the cost of pork production. Most of the costs are animal feed, and so the Europeans can afford this. And I think if the United States moved in that direction, we'd be doing ourselves a big favor. Already, because of pressure from consumers that are concerned with animal welfare, a number of states, through ballot issues or through legislative initiatives, have moved toward pork production that will not allow the use of gestation crates for pregnant sows, that will not allow the use of battery cages for egg-laying hens. I think, and not just ballot measures, but consumer pressures through the marketplace have obliged a lot of livestock production companies and retailers and food service companies like McDonald's to make pledges to be crate-free and cage-free in the years ahead. And many have already achieved those goals. So I think the way out for the United States for animal welfare is to place much tighter restrictions on the circumstances under which animals are raised indoors. But I wouldn't send them outdoors, and I wouldn't back away from the progress that we've made in livestock productivity, because it's been very good for, once again, for the environment. Most people don't realize that beef production in the United States today, which the animals are finished in feedlots, they're not on grass all the way until they finally reach a market weight. They gain weight in feedlots. This system, since the 1970s, has meant that every pound of beef production it uses 12% less water, 19% less feed, 33% land, and we do it with 30% fewer animals. That's a saving to the environment. For pork production, average feed requirements per pound of added weight gain are down 50% since the 1990s. For broiler chickens, average feed requirements per pound of meat are down 1/3. And most of all, for dairy production, this is astonishing. When I tell students that we're producing much more milk today with so many fewer cows, they aren't certain that I've got the data right. But feed requirements for 100 pounds of milk, 2/3 less food and water, 90% less land, and 79% fewer cows. And fewer cows means fewer greenhouse gas emissions, less methane being belched into the atmosphere to warm the climate. An animal scientist who's also an atmospheric scientist at UC Davis has been able to show that dairy production today emits so many fewer greenhouse gases that the climate burden of a glass of milk today is 2/3 smaller than it was in 1950. So we don't want to turn back the clock. We don't want to turn back the clock. We have to, whether it's plant-based imitation meats or modern livestock production systems corrected for the inadequate space and welfare consideration given to the animals today, those are systems I don't want to abandon. People who want to go back to old McDonald farms aren't being realistic about the environmental burden, the labor costs, and the climate consequences of trying to produce as much meat as we produce today using those farms.
I do want to talk a bit more about meat, but this is a good place to bring in a question from one of our audience that says, I'm curious about plant-based beverages. Almond milk in particular require a huge amount of water to produce. How does that play into weighing the pros and cons environmentally?
Well, you wouldn't want to produce a water-intensive imitation milk in a water-scarce region.
Like California?
But there are a lot of parts of the world and parts of our country that are not water scarce. Of course, in the United States, the water gradient from northeast to southwest just keeps going down. We produce a lot of almonds in Southern California. And we produce those almonds using a lot of irrigation water. But even that is improving. We have computer operated drip irrigation systems that have reduced the water requirements of almond groves in Southern California significantly. I'm not going to say that almond milk is the way of the future. Actually, oat milk has taken off.
That's what I'm hearing, oat milk, or perhaps potato milk.
Yeah. And so if it's a crop that you can grow, you can't grow almonds in New England, but you can grow a lot of potatoes in New England. You can grow oats in New England. They used to grow it all the time. So it all depends upon geography.
Before we go on, do you have time to stay a little bit later this since we got a late start, maybe an extra 10 minutes past the hour?
Sure, I could do that.
Okay, great. I have a lot of questions, and there are some. So I'll bring in another question here from the audience while we're talking about the sustainability issues. How confident are you that imitation meat, either plant-based or cell-based, environmental assessments accurately capture the energy needed for production? Are comparisons of greenhouse gas emission impacts for production of a pound of meat fairly showing the differences in environmental production?
Yeah, I'm not an expert on life cycle assessments. It's a science by itself, and the risks of double counting things and of not counting things are always there. How do you put a boundary around a product before you look at the emissions in its life cycle? It's an inexact science. And energy use, well, what do you do for real meat? If an animal is finished in a feedlot, how far do you go in counting that as energy use? You have to go back to the diesel fuel that was burned in harvesting the feed crops that are fed to the animal. You have to go back to the production of the fertilizer that went into growing those crops before they were harvested. How far back do you go in the life cycle? If you go back as far as possible, you can increase the purported energy requirement of something too much. And I'm not an expert on where to draw those lines.
Yeah, I mean, some of this does become extremely complicated, and often, as we've noted already, it's not always about science anyway. You know, there's so many other issues influencing food production and eating habits. So you did mention, we talked about the impact of consumer pressure on changing the way that livestock are managed and handled. But you also mentioned that some of the better models for animal welfare don't meet consumer demands for convenience and affordability. And we also see that consumers, as evidenced by their buying habits, want junk food and fast food. So must our food supply cater to the lowest common denominator at the cost of animal welfare, health, and the climate? What role do education, regulation, incentives, and penalties play in all this?
Well, I don't think there's a common denominator to the way food is produced or the way food is purchased and eaten in the United States. What strikes me is the enormous diversity of production systems. I've called it multi-agriculturalism, and also the enormous diversity of appetites. We have so many different kinds of eaters in the United States. One restaurant industry consultant described 5 different kinds of eaters, very different. Some are basic eaters; they just want something that's cheap. Others are lifestyle eaters; they want ambiance. Others are interested in well-prepared foods, even if they're not healthy. Others are interested in fad foods, even though they're not healthy. And only one group of those restaurant eaters is predominantly there for personal health. And I don't know how much that's going to change. A lot of people a lot of people eat their healthy food at home and save their indulgences for a restaurant visit. And we're all different. Some people eat nothing but unhealthy food at home and at restaurants at the same time. And it varies region by region. It varies culture by culture. It varies by level of educational attainment and health consciousness. A lot of people say, oh, well, vegetarian diets are healthier. But if you do surveys of the health of vegetarians versus non-vegetarians, and if you include in those surveys questions about the health consciousness of all of those eaters, it may not be the vegetarian food that's making the vegetarians more healthy. It could be their health consciousness, which has made them adjust all the other lifestyle behaviors that can compromise health. So what's fascinating to me about our food manufacturing and retailing and food service sectors is that they don't want to lose any customers. They'll service any preference. The minute people get interested in a keto diet, suddenly it's there on the shelf. We're doing keto for you. You want keto? We'll give you keto. The food industry is we have more than 3,000 different food companies in the United States. A lot of them they just got started and they're growing fast, and they'll be bought up by the big companies soon, but they're always out there looking for the next way to get a niche. And there are so many different preferences among eaters in the United States to serve that there's no risk that we're going to have a homogenized diet anytime soon. Yeah, sometimes it makes having a dinner party in your own home very difficult, by the way.
Yes, that's true. COVID aside. You offered in your book and earlier in this conversation, you offered some fascinating insights into how food companies and advertisers basically function like legal drug dealers in terms of creating and peddling products that are addictive. Yet we've seen how the high fat, high sugar, low fiber Western diet is clearly harmful to health and has a societal impact economically and socially. So how do we manage these interests? Do we just let the marketplace prevail, or do we need to crack down on what these companies are doing, improve consumer education? I mean, what's the answer here?
Yeah, I would not just let the marketplace prevail. Once again, I think we can learn a lot from European countries in this regard. Obesity rates on the continent of Europe are only half as high as in the United States. And one reason, there are a lot of reasons for that. One reason is European countries aren't afraid they're not afraid to tax groceries. They have a value-added tax. In some countries, that makes food more expensive. In the United States, we seldom even tax the empty calories in sugar-sweetened beverages. I think we should have a tax on sugar-sweetened beverages, which have been driving a lot of our obesity crisis over the years and the incidence of type 2 diabetes. I wouldn't hesitate to tax sugar sweetened beverages. Some municipalities have started to do that now. I think that should continue. Also, I think we should place restrictions on the advertising of some foods to children. European countries place restrictions on food ads on television for children's programs or during Saturday morning children's broadcasting hours. We haven't done that. One reason is that the Supreme Court found decades ago that advertising was commercial speech and protected under the First Amendment. I think it's time to revisit that outmoded reason for not putting any restrictions on the food ads that are driving young children toward unhealthy products early in their life. I think there are a lot of things that we can do in the United States. Also, we need to have nutrition labeling on consumer packaged goods in the European Union and in other countries around the world. They have nutrition symbols on the front of the package, giving the consumer guidance at a glance on the product. Does it have too much sugar? It's not going to get a green check mark. Does it have too much fat? It's not going to get a green check mark. Does it have too much salt? It's not going to get a green check mark. In the UK, they have a stoplight system with 3 different colors. The food companies in the United States imitated that with a voluntary system, but there aren't any color codes, so you can't make sense of it as you're just walking past the aisle. I think if we had front of packaging labels, if we had taxes on sugar sweetened beverages, and if we had restrictions on advertising unhealthy foods to children, we'd be moving in a European direction. It'd be much to our benefit.
It's interesting. There are areas we want to move in the European direction, but when it comes to, say, regulation of biotech, we don't want to go in that direction.
I agree with you there.
Which does lead us to, you've mentioned that we talk about borrowing the best from many systems. And it's always seemed to me that there's room for everything, industrial, lifestyle, synthetic, you pick, biotech, organic. Why is there this tendency toward absolutism? And how can we get to that place where we are borrowing the best of all the systems?
Yeah. People like, in the abstract, they love purity. Mm-hmm. But scientists know that it's an almost meaningless word in the real world. Parts per billion, nothing's pure.
Right.
And the problem in my mind, the problem with seeking purity is the purists who try to turn this into a marketing ploy or the basis for regulation. That misfires all the time. I mean, look at. I know I'm going to make enemies if I say anything about the organic standard that isn't always flattering all the time. But what I don't like about the organic standard is that it's a standard of purity, 0 tolerance for synthetic chemicals. Even though the nitrogen in manufactured fertilizers is the same element in the periodic table as the nitrogen that you find in animal manure. They draw a distinction and say you can't have any manufactured nitrogen fertilizer. That really gets in the way of a sensible way of managing fertilizer use. Instead of just reducing fertilizer use to a point where you don't have unwanted runoff, where you don't have unwanted leaching, instead of bringing fertilizer use down to an optimal level, you have to bring it down to 0 to be certified as an organic farmer. Of course, most farmers don't want to do that. Synthetic fertilizer is probably the single most important scientific discovery for productive agriculture in the last 120 years. Most farmers don't want to do without it. They want to reduce their use of it, and they are, as I said earlier. It saves them money if they don't use excess quantities of nitrogen fertilizer. That's one thing precision farming's been very good at. They don't want to reduce it to zero. And that's why the organic standard, why it's popular with consumers. They're willing to pay a significant premium for organic products. It's never really been popular with farmers. The certified organic cropland in the United States today is only about 1% of total cropland. Organic farmers, if they're big industrial organic farmers, they can work around this restriction. They can get access to a lot of animal manure from the livestock industry and turn it into compost. To control weeds, they can put down a lot of black plastic mulch, or they can use flamethrowers, gas-powered flamethrowers instead of herbicides. And they can make good money that way, but still it's only 1% of US harvested cropland. And that's because of the needless purity fixation that organic advocates have tied themselves to.
Mm-hmm. I mean, again, it goes back to education. I think there are certain organic practices that if people really knew about them, like their use of plastic mulch, et cetera, it could be a bit of a turnoff, but it's difficult to get around that mystique that's been created. So I'll just ask you one last question here, and that is, we're dealing with the global pandemic, unprecedented natural disasters, rapidly warming climate, and now the specter of a nuclear war. So do you foresee a time when we may no longer enjoy the luxury of these debates around food and its production? Are we already there?
Oh, that's a thoughtful question. I think there are places in our food system where the urgency of past problems is much diminished. We don't have serious problems with food deprivation anymore in advanced affluent countries. We have a whole new problem, which is poor dietary health because of excess food consumption. But there are parts of the world where the food consumption problem hasn't been solved, and where the welfare of small farmers is still deficient because agricultural production is still deficient. Smallholder farmers in Africa, I've worked in 15 or 16 different countries in Africa, and I'm always shocked when I head up country and see farmers on small plots, mostly women farmers, who don't yet have any of the things that farmers in the United States or in other rich countries have to make their labor more productive and to escape poverty. They don't have irrigation. They don't have veterinary medicine for their animals. They don't have purchased fertilizers. They don't have any pesticides, insecticides, or herbicides. They don't have power, either diesel generator or electric power. Many of them don't have access to good schools or clinics. Their road systems are deficient. 70% of them live more than 2 kilometers from the nearest all-weather road. So during the rainy season, they're essentially cut off from the world of productive commerce. These problems are not on their way to being quickly or easily solved. I blame in part the donor community, which is telling these farmers they shouldn't use more fertilizer. They should embrace agroecology instead. But I also blame the governments of these countries who lead political systems that are essentially insensitive to the needs of the rural poor. Poor women farmers in the countryside in Africa don't really have much of a political voice. Many of them are still illiterate. They don't read or write in any language. They're physically distant from the capital city, so they can't make trouble. They're not armed. They're divided among themselves because of persistent ethnic differences. they're physically cut off. It's a poverty trap that they have not yet been able to escape, and it's a poverty trap that leaves them politically silent as well as economically poor. And I would encourage people getting into the food and agricultural space who are looking for an unsolved challenge to spend a little more time looking at the circumstances of the rural poor in Africa.
Mm-hmm. You know, you're such a wealth of information on this, and I am going to ask you one more question, and that is, in his review of your book, Nicholas Kristof said that you're not an ideologue. So how did you manage to avoid that? You know, I mean, most everyone I know on all sides of this issue, it's so difficult to stay away from really strong ideology. So tell us a little bit about how you managed to take a more impartial view.
Well, I do my best. I grew up in a conservative Midwestern family. You know, my dad voted for FDR, but then he became a Republican for the rest of his life. My mom was a Republican, but then she voted for Jimmy Carter and became a Democrat the rest of her life. So I give my mom some credit for having an independent streak. You know, I spent my professional life mostly. I grew up in the Midwest, but I spent my professional life in New England, surrounded by people who are as rigidly democratic as my friends back in Indiana were rigidly Republican. And so I was able to spot that tendency and identify it pretty quickly as a weakness that I wanted to avoid. It's you know, it's made some things more difficult. You know, in the academic departments I've been in, which are not at ag schools in the Midwest, they're political science departments at institutions like Wellesley College. Mm-hmm. I mean, I'm a Democrat, but I'm the most conservative person in the department. So the academic world has I mean, it's invested a lot in what it calls diversity, but that includes everything but partisan diversity, and I think that's been a big mistake, and I don't think it's helping academic institutions today. The secret is out, and they can't get along much longer with so completely ignoring the opinions of half of the country.
Yeah. Well, I want to thank you for, you know, helping us to see a way of approaching this very complex and, you know, emotionally charged issue of food and production and all that in a more, you know, straightforward, impartial way. And I really urge people to look at your book, and, you know, it's a great treatise on what's happening now and some practical solutions on how to deal with these problems. So thanks again for joining us, and also for your patience through our technical difficulties at the start of the session.
Okay, my publicist would say, don't end the session without repeating the title of the book one more time.
Yes.
Which is Resetting the Table, Straight Talk About the Food You Grow and Eat. And you know, this is a Alliance for Science program, so we got to talk about science in the last word. I would say, don't be afraid of the mantra, follow the science. When it comes to COVID, follow the science. When it comes to climate change, follow the science. But also when it comes to agriculture, please follow the science. That would be my closing comment.
Yeah, I think there's a lot to be said in that. Thanks again, Rob, and take good care. I hope to talk with you again.
Great.